Hi, everyone. Great to see so many of you joining us today. Thanks so much. And thanks for working with us on the rescheduling. Welcome to our fireside chat on US tariffs, our economy, and the social impact sector. I'll let Bruce introduce our guest momentarily. And for now, we're just going to get started with a couple of technical considerations and meeting norms. So, the recording, it is being recorded today, and all of you will receive a copy of the session in the next couple of weeks. The closed captions are enabled and can be turned on via the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window. For microphone use, everyone is automatically muted right now and your cameras are off. We ask you to stay muted to avoid any feedback noises. And during the question and answer period at the end, please use the Q&A function, which can be found via the toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom window. In terms of technical support, you can use the chat box to ask for technical support throughout the meeting, and we'll do our best to help you. Although our event is run in English, we welcome questions. And Imagine Canada is committed to providing a safe space for
Megan,
individuals who.
Megan, you're cutting out a fair bit, at least for me.
Ooh,
Stephen, is that the same thing?
Yeah, you
Bruce,
froze
do
a little bit
you
there.
want to take Bruce?
Yeah, maybe I'll take this next
Yeah,
land acknowledgement.
go for it.
Again, thanks everyone for joining us. Before we get into the conversation, just wanted to take a moment for a land acknowledgement. And given that this is hosted by Imagine Canada, we thought we would use ours, but invite you to reflect on where you are located. So Imagine Canada's staff, operations, work, and network depend on traditional Indigenous territories to provide us physical space, sustenance, safety, and community to work, live, and play. Our physical head office is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. We acknowledge that these lands are covered by Treaty 13 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge these lands are still home to many diverse nations, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Megan, if you can just thank you. We acknowledge that our ability to live and work on these lands today is a direct benefit of the policies of expulsion and assimilation of Indigenous peoples during the time of settlement and confederation and since. The harms of these policies are many and are still being felt in Indigenous communities today. We express gratitude towards the Indigenous peoples who have and will continue to steward these lands. We commit to amplifying the voices of Indigenous peoples and working against the everyday forces of white supremacy and colonialism present in the nonprofit sector. And so, as we're all joining in remotely, I'd like to take for each of us to take a short moment to reflect on the lands in which each of us is situated, the land that each of us is living on, working on, and that's allowing us to join in this virtual community today. So thank you. And there are resources on our website as it relates to an expanded version of our land acknowledgement. So with that, we're going to turn our attention to talking about some of the most pressing issues that are facing our country. And as part of that country, the charitable and nonprofit sector. And we're really delighted that Stephen has joined us today. Stephen Tapp is the chief economist for the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and has graciously agreed to spend some time with us to help us kind of unpack and sort this through. And is a trooper because not only was he caught in a snowstorm that Ontario and Quebec experienced over the last week and into the weekend, agreed to quickly make sure that we were able to get this session rescheduled. So, Stephen, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us here today.
Thank you very much, Bruce. I wanted to apologize here to say that I'm sorry we had to schedule. I've been doing this for 20 some odd years now. Always made an event and then was stuck. I actually got stuck in 2 snowstorms last week. So I was stuck in coming back from Victoria through Toronto to Ottawa. And then my son had a hockey tournament in Montreal, and we had to stay over Sunday night because Sunday was a huge blizzard and there's so much snow in our place in Ottawa. So anyway, apologies for that, but happy this is happening virtually and online. So happy we could book it back again soon, and looking forward to your discussion and your questions. I will say I don't have everything all figured out right now. We're like much like the snow, we're trying to kind of get caught up and keep pace with all the news from Trump, and there's been obviously quite a lot over the last few weeks.
Yeah, much like the snow, it just seems to pile on one after the other. So for the as Megan mentioned, there is an opportunity for folks to ask questions. We've got a number of kind of scripted questions, but also very curious to hear what you're interested in exploring. Just in terms of the structure of the conversation, we're going to start wide and really just understand what the role of chief economist at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce is. Talk about some of the underlying beliefs as to why this sort of economic approach is being taken by the US administration, and then start to zero in a bit about the tariffs themselves and what the impact to the charitable and nonprofit sector might be. So with that, maybe Stephen, just kick off and tell us a bit about your role with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce and how you engage with businesses across the country to ensure that they have the latest thinking about the state of our economy.
Sure. Well, that's a softball to start. So thank you, Bruce. I'm the chief economist at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. I'm also the SVP of Research, Data, and Analytics, which means in this role, we have created the Business Data Lab. So I came over from Export Development Canada, which was my last job, and going through all of Trump's first term at that point in time has situated us well for Trump's second term. But the real objective of our work was to create the Business Data Lab, which is a partnership that is currently funded now through ISED, but we work in partnership with StatCan, who's the official data provider in Canada. And so this came about actually early in the pandemic when we were approached by StatCan to do a survey of our members because we have a lot of over 200,000 Canadian businesses represented across the country. And as the pandemic and things were closed in March, mid-March of 2020, people really wanted to know what the impact would be on the economy. And most of the official statistics, let's say GDP as an example, would usually take 2 months to come out. Information on the number of businesses, openings and closings, and all those other things often relied on tax filer data, and that would take a year or two. And so the government was keen to figure out where are the pain points? Are there differences across sectors or differences across locations? And how can we really leverage big data and analytics in a way that I think is helpful to do outside of StatCan because we are able to connect directly to businesses and understand, some of the most important issues for them. So we eventually turned things over to StatCan to do the survey, which has become the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions. And our role now is to analyze the survey, to disseminate the survey, to work with businesses. I explain in our presentations to businesses sort of what the on-the-ground conditions are in their local economies. And these are data points that we never would have had before, but also helps to feed back to StatCan to say these are the issues that businesses are really caring about, because as folks are working on the data sets themselves, they're more focused on statistical relevance and all the rest of it, but less focused on, is this a question that needs to be answered by business right now? So we've sort of seen this symbiotic relationship. We have been funded through a couple budget announcements, and I have a team now of a few economists, some data scientists, and a researcher who's kind of building out our research agenda. And so we've gone from the business surveys to building up lots of different tools and dashboards and data points that are available on our website, which is businessdatalab.ca. Most recently been working on trade data, but we earlier in the pandemic were looking at mobility data, which is looking at mobile phones and where people were returning to the office and what are the cities that were returning quicker than other cities. We have payments data as well. So that data looks, really a lot of this is trying to get faster data than official statistics were able to provide, and trying to get data that's more localized than previously. If you'd go on the website, sometimes you would see national data, and I do presentations across the country, and people are interested to know what the national unemployment rate, but they don't really care. They want to know what the unemployment rate is. And if you're in Waterloo, you want to know what are the conditions, what's spending like in Waterloo, what's the labor market like in Waterloo, are people hiring? And previously we often relied on anecdotes and stories about those things, and now we are able, I think, in a real way to get to the heart of it and get more useful, more granular data. So we engage with businesses, throughout presentations and our websites and different events through the Chamber Network.
That's great. And I know that the Canadian Survey on Business Conditions is something that we use quite regularly because it's one of the few survey instruments that allows us to break out at scale opinions that include both private sector leaders and nonprofit leaders. So it's a great tool for us. So before we talk about the specifics of the tariffs, I wanted to ask about the underlying strategy and goals that we think are behind what's going on from the Trump administration. It seems that the early executive orders are following the playbook coming from the President's Council of Economic Advisors. And the chair of this group, Stephen Tapp, has written about the relationship between tariffs, U.S. monetary policy, the costs to the U.S. of being the military defender of liberal democracies, and the fact that many countries' currencies depend on US dollars as reserves. So, from your perspective, what do you see as the larger objective or objectives that might be in play behind some of this tariff strategy?
Yeah, you're right, Bruce. We got from the softballs now to the hardballs. So this is what really people are trying to. I've been giving presentations on Trump and trying to understand what the motivations have been. We've thought through this again, been through the first term. So I think back to the presidential debate where Harris was debating Trump, and she accused him of not having really any coherent plan on healthcare. And Trump actually said, "Well, no, that's not true. I have the concept of a plan." Which I think in Trump's thinking was that you don't need to sit down and write out enumerated bullet line by line explanations and strategies of what you're going to do. You need to set the yardsticks really far out there. As somebody who works, through a negotiating lens, he's going to start to shift things in a way that makes the U.S. first, as the America first kind of doctrine. And I think so. You talked about the Stephen Marion and others. There is a lot of academic and research and other work that is now ex post feeding into or rationalizing some of this thinking. But I would say that the general underlying view from Trump and the Trump group in the second term is echoing some of the first. The U.S. is being taken advantage of, according to Trump and his followers, and this is the story told to citizens. Others, including Canada, but other countries have been really free riding off of the defense shield that the U.S. has provided. That the U.S. spends, I don't know the numbers exactly, but on defense orders of magnitude more than everybody else in the world, and that therefore suggests that they're taking care of allies, and we're not paying our NATO bill and those sorts of things. So I think there's a general story and narrative about being taken advantage of. The defense part, as you mentioned, Trump does have a very weird way to take score on the trade side. So they do look very carefully at bilateral trade deficits and looking at, do we export more than we import from country X, Y, or Z? I've been doing trade and trade policy in Canada for years. That is not it's a very outdated view of the world, and economics is more or less demolished if that view made any sense in the 1800s, I think, in mercantilism a long time ago. But Trump sees that as the U.S. losing. So if we sell them more than they sell to us, then the U.S. is losing. This is not a mutually beneficial trade by individual partners or by consumers or businesses. And then I think another key part of the story is that the U.S. has had this hollowing out through trade. So trade in general has been bad. Trump has been, pushing against trade back. I think he had a New York Times article back against Japan in the 80s. So this is a long-held view of Trump that international trade is bad, and other countries rip us off when they take part in mutually beneficial voluntary trade. But that the manufacturing jobs in the U.S. are the ones that have been hollowed out. And those are and we've had, of course, in Canada, all the middle class discussions, right? Of the how do we create jobs for the middle class and those working hard to join it. I think this is the different part that you're seeing on the southern border. And so the idea that manufacturing things in the US on itself is good, it is important. And if the US has to pay more for that, because the way that supply chains have been built is we have distributed labor where it's cheaper to do this at different parts and pieces and specialized across the world. The US is sort of prepared as an administration to impose a cost on others, but also I think pay their own costs. So the US is thinking now, as Trump is in the negotiating world, we have a strategic advantage. We have the largest domestic market in the world. And so if people want the access to that market that they've had before, they don't need to be nice anymore. They don't need to be restrained. This is presumably his final term. So he's pretty much feeling like he has the weight behind him to throw the US weight around and to use tariffs, as we'll talk more about tariffs. But these are in part seen as a way to get concessions, to get other people's attention, get them to the table, and to try to negotiate leverage. and they're also a way that they can raise revenue. So I think the other part of the strategy, so sort of talk a little bit about the objectives of the story, the narrative. The Trump strategy was really, I think, revealed. Was Steve Bannon talked a lot about this flood the zone kind of idea, where the media doesn't have capacity to take on. We don't have local independent reporters doing going to the state capitals to the same extent we had before. And so if you just release everything, and if you just write 5,000 executive orders a day, some of these things you're going to keep pushing and keep pushing, and at some point some legal person will say, wait a minute, actually, that's legally not your authority and you can't do that. But you're going to push on every dimension at all points in time. It's sort of the move fast and break things story that Facebook has had, but this is now for government. Um, and so I think you've also had people like Trump who have been convicted, pardoned other people from January 6th. I've read many bios on Musk, and I think he does feel as the world's richest man that they're sort of beyond. There is no legal ramifications for what they're doing. So I think you've seen kind of two people that are super emboldened and have the view that the US could be doing better than it is. And so now they're going to go and push in all those dimensions in all those ways until somebody tells them that they can't. And so I think that's sort of, a long-winded answer, but that's sort of what we're seeing right now playing out.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and I mean, I think the scariest words that you said in there was presumably the last term. This idea that that might not be just an automatic. I want to pick up a little bit on your comments about sort of the economic strategy and how it relates to employment, particularly in the U.S., and then we'll kind of start moving on to tariffs. It's my understanding that a desire to restore the dignity of U.S. workers, particularly in the heartland of the U.S., through good paying manufacturing jobs is central to the tariff
Yeah.
decisions we're seeing. According to the BBC, when Trump first implemented tariffs on steel in 2018, employment in U.S. steel was 84,000. A couple of years later, by 2020, that had dropped to 80,000. So there wasn't necessarily a direct correlation. Now it might have. There's some who would argue that maybe it staved off steeper drops. But there was a Harvard University report that came out from January of last year that looked at the 2018-2019 trade war. So this is a bit of a long-winded question, but I'm getting there. That concluded so far the trade war has not provided economic help to the U.S. heartland. Import tariffs on foreign goods neither raised nor lowered U.S. employment in newly protected sectors. Retaliatory tariffs that other countries imposed had clear negative employment impacts, primarily in agriculture, and these harms were only partly mitigated by compensatory U.S. agricultural subsidies. So basically saying that there would have been more harm had the U.S. government not jumped in with some subsidies. So where do you see the employment benefit? Where's that supposed to come from when so far in the first Trump administration, the tariffs didn't seem to provide it?
So there's a lot to the question there to unpack. I think the first part, and you mentioned before, and sort of the Stephen Marion story, like Trump is not sitting down and reading these studies. I think we should be very clear that anything that's produced from the NBER or Harvard or somewhere else may be feeding up, and there may be briefing notes in these discussions, and people that understand the economics maybe explain this to him. But I think what I take away from the first term is that Trump thinks that he won the trade war. Trump came out in 2017 and said trade wars are good and easy to win. And there's a lot of hyperbole on his social media, but I think he actually believes that the back and forth with China, and we got caught up in that in the NAFTA renegotiation, but I think he thinks that he won. And I think therefore, as we're in the second stage, I don't think that we're going to see sort of a recoiling or coming back. I think we're going to see this more sort of Trump unhinged. The more specific part of the economics of your question is right. If you think about manufacturing or steel, aluminum as an input into, let's say, your refrigerator, your car, all these other different parts, in theory, you could save 100 jobs in the upstream part of this, which is rolling the steel or that sort of thing. But then the people who are using the steel are going to be paying, in some cases, it's a 25% tariff. So that's going to essentially increase their cost by 25%. That's going to reduce the demand for their output. So there's going to be fewer cars purchased because we know that the price of trucks will go up by, could be $5,000 if we start levying tariffs every time a truck crosses the border. So I think it's possible that there is an employment benefit, or at least that, the manufacturing sector employment has gone down significantly. And the problem, I think, for people in those situations, and if you look politically, all of the swing states went to Trump. And and part of your point too as well is the tariffs themselves didn't actually work, but the retaliation to the tariffs hit these red rural areas. But guess what? The vast majority of those red rural areas, even with being hit by counter tariffs by others, voted for Trump again. So there is something, I think, going on, misinformation, disinformation, a lot of other things that have happened over the course of, since 2016. Um, it's hard to say if people are voting against their own interests. I think people believe that this is in their interest. I think that Trump believes that the story that we can save these jobs, and these jobs that require, in many cases, it's often men working long shifts underground, or digging things out of the earth and making things with their hands, that these are the people that he's appealing to, and that feel that they have been alienated or left behind, or the economy has not been working for them. And so I think that's where you've seen the movement in the last, well, going back a couple elections now. Trump has won more and more of those votes, in those main ridings, and he's really pushed that strategy. So I think the summary part to your answer is, I think it's both the case that the economics doesn't work out particularly well. It just raises business input costs, and it reduces employment in general. But those jobs, as being seen as the man who's really fighting for the Pittsburgh steel worker, and then you're going to get less clarity or less pushback from the service sector worker in another state whose job may have been dislocated by some of the ramifications of these things, but at least you can go on a one of his 4-hour discussions, and you can talk about that one thing that you did. So I think in part it's the perception, and in part it's playing to what the US electorate is saying, that they do feel like the trading system has not worked well for them, and they do feel like China's accession into WTO 20 years ago has been a pretty big dislocation, and most of those people feel they're in a worse situation now than they would have been 20 years ago if they still had their their previous job.
Yeah, and it's interesting, the other conclusion that Harvard study came to, or one of their findings, was that the trade war appears to have been successful in strengthening support for the Republican Party, and fewer voters in those areas were identifying as Democrats. And I thought one of the last lines was that voters thus appear to have responded favorably to the extension of tariff protections to local industries despite their economic cost. So even where they didn't work or they had harmful effects, I think your point about having an administration that in their minds was defending them has therefore created a whole swath of new voters for the Republican Party.
Yeah,
So
and
let,
so just
yeah,
on that, but I do think that, again, I think the takeaway for Trump was that if anything, he should have gone harder on the tariffs in the first round. And if the people who were holding him back had only just let him do what he wanted to do, which he's doing now, he would have won, larger than he won the first time, even despite some of the evidence there, which I think is just comes down to, again, voter salience. You see Trump everywhere. You can't not see Trump. You can't not look at a newspaper or go online. Trump is everywhere. And if his story is one where he's on your side, he's fighting for you, then who clicks on the article, who reads the article, who fact checks the article, and who is reading this Harvard study. So it's a pretty hard uphill battle in a world now where we have these bifurcated social media chambers that are telling people what they kind of want to hear.
well, I read it because I'm interviewing a chief economist. I need to have like some kind of knowledge about this. But anyway, so
Well,
let's
I'm
go
not
right.
saying nobody's reading. I'm just saying the millions of
No, I'm
people who
just
are
kidding.
looking at their phones on Twitter are getting a different message than
Yeah,
I do research, and we try to get our research out there. It's hard to make a splash in that social
yeah.
media world with objective fact-based analysis versus other
Abs
things. Yeah.
Absolutely. So let's go straight to the tariffs now and the potential impact to the Canadian economy. So, first of all, it'd be great to just make sure that everyone understands what a tariff is. So, President Trump has characterized tariffs as a tax on other countries, and that's simply false. So, maybe you can just provide a brief description of what a tariff really is. That way, we just got a kind of a level set for the
Yeah,
rest of the
yeah, and,
conversation.
and I think that's the other part of the story too. Is he, in one of the executive orders of the hundreds of executive orders, said he's going to have an external revenue agency. So the internal revenue agency, looking at collection of taxes, again, the story that Trump is telling, which is blatantly false in the logical sense, is that foreigners are paying these taxes. Well, no. So a tariff is a tax on an import paid by the importer. So if you are a U.S. business and you're bringing across steel, as an example, from Canada, or aluminum from Canada, as the example where he's on steel aluminum, um, essentially the price is $100,000 or $10,000. They're adding 25% onto that. You need to remit that. There is a discussion and debate economically of, will that result in changes in the exchange rate? Will that, and if it is broad based, and then I think if there were a 25% tariff across the board, you've already seen Canada's exchange rate go down over the last while, largely related to that. So there could be a sense in which foreigners are paying the tariff, in the sense of, in Canada, if the exchange rate goes from 75 cents to 65 cents in a pretty extreme world, then that could offset some of the higher costs that U.S. importers would pay, in the sense that their dollar's now stronger, so they need fewer dollars to buy our goods. But in general, all the research that we've done looks at the interconnected nature of these supply chains, and the fact that most of our trade, about 3/4 of our trade with the U.S., is done through businesses from inputs or capital, that this essentially will directly raise the costs on U.S. businesses. If we retaliate, they will similarly raise costs for Canadian importers and Canadian businesses, and that those prices could be adjusted in profit margins or other things, but that would mean that American businesses have less money, and or it could mean that the prices go up for consumers in the U.S. And so we did see a differentiation on the energy side. So Trump, cognizant of the fact that we export a lot of oil to the United States, and so if they were paying a 25% import tariff on that, prices at the pump would go up. So he decided, in an ad hoc nature, that would be a 10% rather than 25%. And so I think there is some understanding that Americans do pay the taxes that the tariffs represent. But again, if you can continually and vociferously and constantly say that foreigners pay these taxes, I would say most of the electorate is not taking an economics course, and most of the electorate is not drawing supply and demand charts, and most of the electorate, if they've been told something 47 times, might think, oh, well, if those Canadians retaliate, the reason that our gas pump has gone up, $1 a gallon, is because they push back against us and they increase their costs or something like that. So I think there is a sort of information war world where you can tell a story that is not true and just repeat it and ad nauseum, and hope that most people aren't informed enough to understand the truth. But the truth is that American consumers, Canadian consumers, businesses as well, would pay higher taxes, higher prices, because this is the opposite of trade liberalization, where we saw lower prices and more productive firms. That's just sort of, we're putting that on its head and thickening the border.
Yeah. Though it is interesting, Marin's writings, Stephen Marin's writings suggests that the strength of U.S. Monetary policy will offset that. So a 25% tariff won't translate into a 25% increase to American consumers because of strength of U.S. dollar, and that'll come way down. It will be an awful lot less noticeable. But let's talk now about the announcement and the threat of the tariffs that are coming in theoretically into place on March 1st. So from your analysis, what does it tell us about the anticipated impacts to the Canadian economy?
So let me sort of section this into, like, there are impacts that are happening now that we know of. And the first mechanism through which those are being felt is the threat of the tariffs has significantly increased uncertainty, both just on what U.S. trade policy is going to be, whether or not Canadian companies will have access to the U.S. market, at what price they'll have. So the uncertainty of the tariffs has already had a negative impact on Canada's economy. It's clear through some of the surveys we've looked at, and there's others in the field right now, but from the first round, we had a lot of information, Export Development Canada, that showed this. The most common reaction of a business owner, if they have a multi-million-dollar project that they're just starting, would be to postpone that. So instead of making a large investment in Canada in 2025 in February, you'll say, oh, well, maybe I'll have some clarity on this in the second quarter and not now. So I do expect that when we start to get more and more of our investment data in Canada, that you'll see business investment has been weak for quite a while, particularly over the last decade as oil prices went down in 2014-15. But I do think that you will see a negative impact on our overall business investment. We've seen business sentiment fall, so you're sort of seeing that. But that's the threat of the tariffs. And one of the things that Trump has really weaponized to try to get people to the table and to try to get concessions that he might not otherwise get. But then if you look at the actual economic impacts and the work that we've done, so Trevor Toom is a professor at the University of Calgary, has written a very nice paper for us that he called Partners in Prosperity, where we looked at both the trade dynamics, but also modeled the impacts of these tariffs in a very sophisticated trade model. And you can kind of believe the details of the model or not, but most of the work that we've done and most of the work that other people have modeled would suggest that in a world where we have broad-based tariffs against Canada's exports to the United States, 25%, 10%, whatever they would be, at the level that Trump has threatened, that would be recessionary on its face for Canada's economy. That would be a significant shock. Of course, it now comes down to, do you believe that the tariffs will come in place? How high do you think the tariffs will be? How broad will they be, and how long will they stay? If the tariffs were to come in place for a few weeks or for a much narrower set of sectors, there would be implications for those sectors, but they wouldn't be as large. And the Bank of Canada just came out with some modeling a few weeks ago as well. So they get hits on the order of 4% of Canadian GDP. So the overall income shock would be about 4% over a couple of years. Our estimates were a little bit less than $2,000, so $1,900 per person in terms of less income or less purchasing power. And so that's significant. It's in the same ballpark as a typical recession that we've had through the 1980s and 1990s. Global financial crisis or the pandemic was, larger than those, but this on its own would be effectively one man, the United States president, determining that he wants to impose a recession on Canada or Mexico or whoever because he can or feels he can. And so we would see disruptions across the supply chains, increased costs, less competitiveness for U.S. businesses, and the usual stuff that you'd expect. It would be bad. There would be some job losses, but I think when we do the actual analysis, it really does come down to, is this tariff applied across the board to most everybody? And is this tariff in place for a long time? Because if I were running a manufacturing sector company in Woodstock and the tariff was on, I wouldn't lay off my entire company on day one. I would think about what the policy response the federal government would put in place, which could include changes to interest rates and changes in the currency. As you said, Canadian dollar would depreciate. That could offset some of these things. There are employment insurance schemes. Through the pandemic, there were a lot of different wage subsidies, other things you could imagine, sector-specific, adjustments and supports. So all that to say is there would and could be disruptions to incomes and jobs lost, but at the point that Trump is threatening now, it would be very significant and very recessionary. We are hoping that cooler heads prevail and we don't actually get to a point where there's a massive tariff in place across Canada's economy for a long period of time. And if there is, the folks who depend upon their livelihood to sell to the US, which is by our guess close to 3 million people in Canada, they're not all going to lose their job, but they are going to be obviously in a harder situation than they would be as we've had great access to the U.S. market for at least since the late 80s, through our initial NAFTA renegotiation where we opened up and brought Mexico in. So I think it's working relatively well for most people. Trump renegotiated the previous agreement and then said that the new NAFTA CUSMA, the USMCA, was the best trade deal in the world, after he had said that NAFTA was the worst trade deal in the world, and it was effectively 98%, roughly the same trade deal. So, it's with these things, it's kind of a little bit tricky to know whether he would really want to fully upend the situation over the long term, or whether he would be fine with a relatively cosmetic short-term fix that would then allow him to go and argue with Europe and argue with China, who I think is the real long-term battle, which was in the first term as well. You would assume it's not picking fights with Canadians who agree, who basically live close to you and go along with you for a long time. It really is them trying to keep cheaper Chinese steel out of their market and disrupting the manufacturing sector there, as opposed to the work that's done almost in concert with Canadian producers.
Mm. So I just want to clarify one data point before I ask you one more question before we kind of now really narrow the beam to be thinking about the impact of all of this to charities and nonprofits here in Canada. So you'd mentioned potential impact of $1,900 per person for this kind of negative implications of the tariffs. So in a two-parent family or two-partner family, that's roughly 3,800, right? So that could be for a family, or is there a different number looking at a family
Um,
unit?
so well, that's the let's just run it at 2,000 to make it simple. That is in a state of the world where Trump comes in with a 25% tariff, and Canada retaliates, and other countries that retaliate with 25% tariff shock on there, and that is looking from an initial point where we're in now to sort of the new steady state longer term. I think, and so basically what that translates into is about 2.5% income shock. So in terms of whatever size the household, you just kind of think about, okay, we had $100, now we have $97 like that. So that's that's the hit. I think again, you've got to keep a bit of a grain of salt on this because there were significant tariffs in place in the 1930s, before the Great Depression, and in 1971, actually, Nixon had some tariffs that were not imposed directly against Canada, but were sort of these across the board tariffs. I have read some of the history books, and Trevor and I got through some of the things. The shock there was not specific to Canada, but it was only in place for about a third of our exports, and was basically phased out over 4 months because it wasn't working particularly well. So again, just the asterisk to say, like, this is a pretty unprecedented and pretty, quite crazy trade policy in place. And so, the impacts, if you got into a world where the policy response wasn't strong, it could be worse. But you could also imagine a state of the world where the Canadian government realizes there's going to be a very massive hit to Southwestern Ontario energy producers, steel, aluminum, and they respond. And so the net effect isn't that we're all made whole and everything's fine, but that ultimately the Canadian dollar would be one mechanism to deal with that shock.
Well, and sorry, Stephen,
Yeah,
that's actually a question that's
yeah,
come in. Does a
yeah.
lower Canadian dollar, does that help or does that hinder in these kinds of
It
situations?
depends. It depends on where you are. So if you, well, my wife won't let us travel to Florida because she's really mad at Trump. And her sense is that when we travel to the States, or if we don't travel to the States, we're sort of, voting with our feet and showing. But if the dollar were to depreciate for a significant period of time, that means everybody's international purchasing power. So when you're buying things outside of Canada, your weak Canadian dollar will buy less. So if you're going to be traveling, that will hit you. If you're going to be, we import maybe 15-20% of the overall consumer basket is imports. So things, electronics are largely imported, fruit and vegetables, fresh fruit and vegetables, things like that, a lot of groceries. So those prices would go up relatively quickly, and the pass through on those things, so that the change is relatively quick. The other part is that a lot of the business inputs that Canada uses for machinery equipment are also imported from abroad, and so it sort of depends. If you're an exporter and you rely on some imports to come in, yes, you may be more competitive in that international market with a 65-cent dollar, but your costs of production are going to go up because when you bring some things across the border yourself, or if we retaliate as well, you'll be hit. So I would say it depends a lot on where you're located, what sector you're in, how directly you're impacted. But there are very few places that would come out ahead in a real trade war. I mentioned to you before, I was almost stuck in Victoria, but Victoria is actually an interesting case study and story because we just released some estimates that looked across 41 different cities in Canada about their vulnerability to different tariffs, like the overall amount that they trade with the United States, and how much of that export basket is going to the States. And there's a couple places that actually are really highly exposed. In St. John, New Brunswick, and Calgary, Alberta, they say the value of oil is really high. They sell a lot of oil. Lethbridge, yep, number 10. Thanks, Jen. Lethbridge is up there on the list. So those places would be hit in a disproportionately negative fashion on the income side, I think, from those tariffs. But our friends in Victoria would be less negatively hit if you assume that there's a buy Canadian sentiment happening right now. So if my wife is not abnormal in terms of the sentiment, then Victoria, as a tourist destination, could actually get people coming from Alberta and Ontario, and the weaker dollar could actually encourage Americans to come across and look for, things that they could purchase, or tourism, and say, oh, I can go to Vancouver now, and I can get a hotel for $100 or whatever it is now. So there are certain areas on the coast that are able to export more so to Europe and to Asia, that are less exposed and less directly dependent upon the United States, they're not going to win in a trade war, but they're going to lose less than other people lose. And then areas in southwestern Ontario, manufacturing, the sort of places that you think on energy side and see aluminum would be, you know, very negatively hit. And it would depend really if there are exemptions or how, you know, policy responds to offset those shocks.
Thank you. So interesting, because it could be very, very targeted in terms of some particular industries or areas of the country, as you mentioned. So let's transition now into some thoughts around what this means for our sector. So, you know, Canada's charities and nonprofits are heavily dependent on a variety of revenue streams. Things like governments creating granting programs or issuing service contracts, corporate Canada investing in communities, community and private foundations that are earning returns that are then distributed to organizations through grants, and individuals, people themselves making donations. So as you think about this sort of four, I would say maybe four main systems, and there's an earned income component in there as well. What do you see the disruption of tariffs doing to our entire system of support? So, you know, as you kind of, you know, maybe look into the crystal ball a little bit, because I'd say if there's one word I would use to describe the conversations I've been having with leaders in our sector at the start of this year, it's apprehension. And so, as you think about these underpinnings, what do you think it might do to it?
Well, let me give you a couple areas and mechanisms and indicators that I look at just as an economist. I don't have a deep background. I've done some studies on charities before or tax situations a long time ago, early in my career, but I'm interested to hear kind of what you're hearing from people as well on the ground. I would say one area I look at, if you're dependent upon households and consumers for essentially discretionary giving, then that's an area where we have seen consumer confidence in Canada. I would describe it as soft. It's relatively weak. The dynamics have changed, though, in that when we had interest rates at 5% for the Bank of Canada last summer, they've come down to 3% now. And so we have seen an improvement in overall consumer sentiment in Canada, although it's still at a pretty weak and fragile state. And so the apprehension you talked about is real. I do see in survey evidence people focusing on necessities over what they view as discretionary spending. So depending upon where you fit in the hierarchy of needs, I could see there being just less giving from households in this environment right now, where they're apprehensive about their jobs or their incomes. So on the consumer side, I would say I wouldn't expect it to be a banner year in 2025 versus previous years. And then similarly, we also have indicators on business sentiment, and I think it's probably a similar story there. I mentioned before a lot of hesitation on larger investments, but I do see relatively weak business sentiment. And so if you are involved in, you know, sponsorships or philanthropic initiatives or other things, these are areas that businesses are sometimes the first to pull back on. Would be advertising. They're not going to lay people off or fire people immediately, but they might say, well, do I need to sponsor this event this year? Or if I do, instead of being the gold level sponsor, can I get myself on the program or be involved, or can we give less? So I think that it will probably be just generally a harder market to get some funds. And so that's on the consumer side and the business side. And then if you look at the government side, I don't have any better news on that side either. I think it looked, as Trudeau was still in power, it looked pretty clear as I was reading the tea leaves that you would have a Poilievre federal conservative majority. That's really changed a lot with the emergence of Mark Carney coming forward as a leadership candidate. And so it's not obvious, but I would say I don't work as closely at the provincial level to know, you know, where the things are there. But I do think that there will be a general sense of fiscal restraint. And so if you're dependent upon government funding, which our organization is dependent on government funding as well, yeah, there's the similar apprehension where people had a longer term plan in mind, and you may need to diversify your revenue sources to think about, I don't want to be fully dependent upon this one sponsor or one provider, because if they pull out, then we're in trouble. But I think that's the sort of usual planning and analysis that you would do. So I would think that in the charitable sector in 2025, it will be I wouldn't put numbers on it, but I would say it's probably a softer, weaker, harder year than even before. But again, I'm curious to hear, since you know the sector well, what are people telling you in terms of what they're seeing on the ground, and how are they doing for raising revenue?
Yeah, I think, well, you flip this back on me. This is kind of fun. No, but I think one of the things will be really important is for organizations to analyze their own data in terms of, where are their dollars coming from?
Yeah,
Because as you talk about kind of softening consumer confidence, in our sector, from an individual giving perspective, less than 9% of all donors provide 71% of all donations. So it
yeah.
is heavily concentrated in older, more affluent donors. One might think
And
that they
maybe,
might be
that's
better
one, sorry to
placed.
jump over. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
saying, and I'll jump over, but I think that's the one area where, when I talked about sort of the overall averages, you are definitely seeing, and we saw this through the pandemic as well, people that have large investments and have assets have actually seen, even through all the market turmoil with Trump, markets in the US, and that's a key indicator for Trump as well. I think he will be very reticent to do something crazy, which is going to throw off the stock market metrics. So if you're still relying on large pocketed funders and donors, most of those folks either have great full-time jobs or have retired by now and have amassed lots of assets. And they haven't been directly or negatively hit by most of the stuff we're talking about, like the other parts. So maybe that's an area where there's more of a silver lining. But sorry, go ahead. You had more to say on that.
Well, I think that for that group, to your point, they may have a little bit more staying power. But the other one, because they're really looking at investment returns, the other group that hugely affects is our private and community foundations, because for those who aren't, digging into endowments, they're investing in the community, dollars earned off of endowments. And so I think this whole idea of organizations keeping their eye, depending on their revenue mix as it relates to the investment returns, will be critically important in their communities. The one I am hearing is event-based fundraising, and I think it
Yeah.
speaks to the 2 points you raised in terms of softening consumer confidence and where companies may pull back quickly. And lots of organizations in Canada are still very heavily dependent on local grassroots events, people buying tickets, companies sponsoring holes at a golf tournament or gala dinners. And it feels like that may be one of the first lines that we really look at in terms of what's happening on the ground, because it could be one of the fastest areas to get impacted.
But it's funny. I travel across the country and the chamber network and see, and I would say that the level, I mean, this is just not necessarily reflective of our own network, but the level of engagement and sponsorship and excitement. Like, I went to Brandon, Manitoba, and there were 350 people there to see me. That is insane in terms of the number of people. They had universities there. So there are always pockets of strength that you find across Canada when you're going across this great and large country, where you'll see, oh, this is a smaller market, but people are really engaged and they do want to be involved with an event or have their logo on something or be part of it, or just sponsor in general to support the overall objectives of the organization. And so I think that really again comes down to, you said you want to look at what your donor base is and where you're doing in the events. The side could be harder. But some of those places that have built up a long history of, if you have an annual golf event and everybody goes every summer, I don't think people are going to say cancel the event. I think there might be fewer rounds of golf or fewer people, or less, prize money, or that, like, in terms of draw prizes and things. But I would still expect the legacy and sort of the ritual of those things to continue, even despite some general economic uncertainty or concern.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. And there's a question, oddly enough, there's a question that's come in for me about, are there parts of the sector that do better or worse during recessions or pullback periods? And maybe I might just make a couple of quick comments on that.
Yeah,
If the pandemic is any indicator, we saw two things happen. One is we have this ongoing inverse relationship. When the economy is disrupted or moves into recession, revenues drop, but demand for service rises, and sometimes
yes.
exponentially. Families are in crisis. If they're losing their jobs, they are coming to our sector for service. So I think that's one
Well,
thing.
you heard about the food banks through the and even
Absolutely.
now, but yeah, So
Absolutely. And so I think what we saw in the pandemic was a shifting to say, what are the most essential services. And I think this was tough for many organizations that were delivering services that might not be evident that they're making a huge social contribution, but they weren't near that top five list kind of thing. And I think that was really hard for many organizations where they weren't as visible as providing those kind of essential services on the ground. So I think that there is a inclination, we saw it at a governmental level, to sort of define in their minds what the most vulnerable parts of the community were, and invest in them. So we may see something similar happen here, but if we
Are
do build
there
resources.
any types of nonprofits organizations that are, because as I said, we did the tariff analysis, sort of relatively better and worse. Who do you see as who would be relatively worse off and who would be, considerably less hit? Are there certain
Yeah,
subsectors or certain areas that
I
you've seen through
again
experience?
going back to the pandemic, I would say that the two that really struggled the most in terms of capturing that kind of market share, if you will, were arts and culture and sport and recreation,
Yeah.
viewed as a way to enhance civic life rather than essential to civic life. And that's just a statement that I heard,
Yeah.
not a
Yeah.
commentary on those. But the other thing was organizational size, and it was less in some cases about uh, what mission or cause area the organization was serving, but what we saw was, and what we've seen in the data is that large organizations are eating more of the fundraising pie than they used to. And
Yeah.
so I think in some cases they've been better equipped from a technological perspective, more comfortable having major gift officers in place and able to maximize
And
some of those
even the
conversations.
technology part could both level the playing field. So you could have, a one or two or a very small operation that could use tech and data in a very sophisticated way. But you almost certainly at the top end, like, so for example, we have done some commission work in different sectors in energy and tech and finance. But areas that I don't do would be like RBC, because they have a very large budget and they have their own team, they have PhD economists. We're not kind of working effectively in those areas, right? Because they can do it. So I think in part the folks at the higher end of organizational structure and capacity are probably already leveraging these tools to micro target through newsletters and the donor lists and other things. And so certainly it's a world now where with technology, you don't need to have a large company to have a large impact. You could have somebody running out their basement with outsourcing some of their marketing budgets or other things, and really having a cause that people get behind, where they can go online and they can raise money and have an impact. But I think you could also see this sort of pushing away, where if you're in a certain sector and there's only so many dollars to go around in a certain market and only so many causes people will support, that the leaders may pull ahead from the smaller folks too. I could imagine that dynamic happening.
Yeah, for sure. It is a very, very complex time. So we actually only have a few minutes. This has just flown past. We only have a few minutes
You had more
left. So
questions too.
yeah. So I am going to go to one more, and then we'll see if any others come in the chat. But as we think about kind of this idea of going forward, and you've alluded to this a little bit in your comments, maybe just two thoughts or two questions. Um, One is related to time. And you talked about the Nixon era tariffs. They were fairly short term, and some were, and even the Trump era tariffs in the first administration, they were on and then they were off. And I'm just curious as to what you think about a potential length of tariffs to achieve their objective, and how do you see the rest of the world responding? I saw something that was saying that intentionally the Trump administration picked Canada and Mexico as its two closest trading partners so that the rest of the world would pay attention to how we got treated. And if they treated their closest friends this way, how are they going to treat the rest of the world? So maybe just any thoughts on sort of possible length and what this means for the rest of the globe and their response.
Yeah. Okay. So on the first part, I would say, having lived through the first Trump administration, um, what did we learn from that episode? Well, we learned that there were never-ending pronouncements and threats, and I think we're going to live. So let's say for the next 4 years, I think it's a relatively safe bet, that so long as Trump is in power, and particularly before the midterms, if they don't lose power, the next 2 years are going to see this. We're just going to see a lot of will he, won't he, what's the tariff on this or that. I do think that he started to push the yardsticks out at such a high level and so aggressive that the eventual place to walk things back, there's now been talk of reciprocal tariffs. It's extremely hard to figure out through the 45 different permutations we've had so far where we'll get. But what we did see through the US and China war as well, which Canada got caught up in a lot of that, but we were not the ultimate end game. It's possible the Trump team has changed in the second version and they do want to raise revenue and they're serious about this and they don't feel that there's any constraints on that. So it's certainly possible that we could see significant tariffs in place for some amount of time. Having said that, given the way that the economy is structured, given the way that business interests and consumer interests are, and given the fact that Trump looks to the stock market to see how well he's doing, I think the most likely outcome is that we go from the threats that have gone all the way to more narrower. So now we're seeing the imposition on steel aluminum, which was a bugbear from the first term. I'm sure that there'll be national security pushes on semiconductors, and supply management is an issue that the U.S. has not liked how we've handled that for a long period of time. So I think that you will see a renegotiation of the Canada-U.S.-Mexico agreement. It was supposed to be scheduled for review in July of 2026. This, and for all intents and purposes, is it. Like, it's happening right now. Trump is saying that he wants this or that. So I don't think that there's any potential to get out of that quickly. I do think if you go back to the first term, what Canada did was negotiate over a series of 8 or 10 rounds, and they didn't rag the puck. They really worked hard to whittle down and to go back and forth and to be strategic about that. I do think as well, in this case, there will be a relatively long and drawn out process to renegotiate some type of North American agreement, I think. I think that the underlying economics and basis for that is still there. So I think that's where we'll go, and I do think you'll see certain sectors hit pretty hard, and then you'll see some exemptions, because when you push too hard on something, you'll have somebody go to Washington and say, well, we actually need this critical mineral. We can't produce something without this thing from Canada. Oh, okay. So then that company, Apple didn't get hit with the tariffs last time because, their president had a dinner with Trump. So it's pretty transactional. So I think the longer term play is likely that we still have a North American trade agreement in place. I think the terms of the agreement will be worse and more in favor to the Americans than they have been historically, and I think that's because the Americans see that their access to their market is worthwhile. They're going to charge people for it. But I think we will get out of here with some sense of sanity and clarity. But I would still put the probability of Trump doing something to make things worse as high enough that we should be concerned. The second part was more about how other folks
And
respond.
Stephen, sorry to interject. We've
Yep.
only got like 20 seconds left here.
Oh, okay. And so the other part, I think you will see other countries around the world, Canada, Mexico, the Europeans. If we're all under attack together, we can all sort of push back together. And I think you will see a relatively united front of economies think that they've been unnecessarily picked on, and they will push back with some force.
Collective pushback and maybe some sanity coming down the road. Maybe we'll leave off with those two thoughts at the end. So Stephen, thank you so much for taking time. I know how incredibly busy you are, to spend some time with us and provide some insights for those in our sector who are really thinking deeply about what this means for their organizations and their ability to provide services in their communities. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of the day, and we'll be looking to do more of these things in the future. So bye for now, everyone.